My name is Renata Cole. I am 29 years old, and I was lying on a hospital bed with an IV taped to the back of my hand when my husband looked at me like I was a faulty appliance he regretted buying. I had just lost our baby. 11 weeks. Not even old enough for the nursery paint we'd already picked out. The doctor had used the word non-viable, and I'd felt the floor of my whole future drop away, and the first thing Marcus said, the very first thing, leaning against the windowsill with his arms crossed, was, "Do you know how much this costs me? The leave, the flights I had to cancel, the partners meeting I missed." I stared at him. I thought grief had made me mishear him. Then he said the rest. "You couldn't even do the one thing you promised me you could do. You're worthless at this, Renata." Completely worthless. A nurse froze in the doorway with a water pitcher in her hand. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the ambulance, on the table, in recovery. I just looked at him and asked him to leave the room. He laughed, actually laughed, and said I was being dramatic again, that this was exactly the kind of overreaction his mother warned him about. Before I tell you what happened 3 days later, when a different kind of stranger walked into my hospital room and called me by a name I hadn't used in 6 years. Tell me, what time is it where you're watching from, and what's the weather like outside your window right now? I'm always curious how far these stories travel. I want you to understand who Marcus Vale was before I tell you who he became to me that week. He was not a monster in public. He was charming, magnetic, the kind of man who remembered the names of waiters and tipped generously in front of an audience. He ran a boutique investment firm with his name on the glass door, and he had built an entire identity around being a man who provided. He proposed to me at a vineyard with a string quartet he'd hired in secret. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I believed I had won some kind of lottery. It took me longer than it should have to notice that his generosity had a ledger attached to it, that every gift came with an invisible invoice I was expected to pay in obedience, gratitude, and silence. When I got pregnant, Marcus treated it like a merger announcement. He told his partners before he told my mother. He picked the due date as if it were a deliverable. And when my body failed to deliver on schedule, he treated my miscarriage the same way he treated a missed quarterly projection, as a personal failure of mine that had inconvenienced him. What Marcus didn't know, what almost nobody in his world knew, was who I had been before I became Renata Vale. Before the vineyard, before the boutique firm, before I learned to make myself smaller at his dinner parties so his colleagues' wives wouldn't feel threatened, I had been Renata Cole, senior compliance counsel at a regulatory consultancy that quietly advised half the investment firms on the East Coast on how not to get themselves indicted. I had walked away from that career the year we got married because Marcus said a working wife sent the wrong message to his investors, who liked the idea of a man who could provide for an entire household alone. I had let that part of myself go quiet. I told myself it was a sacrifice for love. Lying in that hospital bed 3 days after losing my child and being called worthless by the man who put a ring on my finger, I understood it had never been a sacrifice. It had been a slow erasure, and I had handed him the eraser myself. The stranger who walked into my hospital room on the 3rd day was a woman named Priya Anand, and I recognized her instantly even though we hadn't spoken in 6 years. She had been a junior associate at my old firm when I left. Now her badge read Senior Director, Regulatory Affairs, and she was holding a folder against her chest like it might try to escape. "Renata Cole," she said, and something in my chest cracked open at the sound of my own name, the real one, spoken like it still belonged to someone. "I heard what happened to you. I'm so sorry about the baby." Then she hesitated, glancing at the door, and said something that changed the entire shape of the week. "I also heard whose firm you married into. Renata, we've had Vale Capital under quiet review for 4 months. I wasn't going to bring this to you while you were grieving, but somebody on your husband's staff already has, and I think you need to see what's in this folder before he finds out you're the one who's about to be asked to explain it. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph. It was a strange, cold clarity, like waking up from a fever and realizing the room had been on fire the entire time you thought you were just hot. Priya explained, carefully, in the language of someone trained not to say more than she's authorized to say, that Vail Capital had been flagged for a pattern of client fund commingling that looked less like an accounting error and more like a structure. She said the regulator's office had been building a file, and that file had recently acquired a witness, a former junior accountant named Daniel Reyes, who had quit Vail Capital 8 months earlier and was now cooperating. She said Daniel's statement referenced conversations he'd had with Marcus directly about keeping the wife's name off everything, and that one of the documents in the file was a power of attorney with my signature on it, a signature I had never given, attached to a holding account I had never opened, dated 2 years prior. The same month Marcus told me I didn't need to worry my head about our finances because he handled all of that now. I sat up in that hospital bed so fast the IV line pulled at my hand. "He forged my signature," I said, and Priya nodded slowly, the way you nod at someone standing at the edge of a cliff they don't yet realize they're standing on. "We believe so. We can't be certain until forensics confirms it, but the timeline fits a pattern we've seen in 3 other entities tied to his firm. Renata, I'm not here as your friend today, even though I am your friend. I'm here because the agency needs someone with compliance background who has access to the internal architecture of Vail Capital to help make sense of what we're looking at, and your name is already attached to the documents whether you sign them or not. You can be a witness who helps us understand this, or you can be the person standing next to him when it collapses. I would much rather you be the first." I thought about the envelope of medical bills Marcus had waved at me like a parking ticket. I thought about the word worthless, how it had landed on me in a hospital bed while I was still bleeding from losing our child, how he hadn't asked me how I felt, hadn't held my hand, hadn't once said the word sorry. I thought about every dinner party where he'd introduced me as my wife. She used to do something with law, very impressive, very boring, like my entire career had been a hobby he tolerated. I looked at Priya and I said, "Show me the file." It took us 4 hours to go through the first 100 pages. By the time we finished, I understood that Marcus had not simply commingled client funds out of laziness or panic. He had built, over 3 years, a structure designed to move money from a senior care fund. A fund built on the retirement savings of people who trusted Vail Capital with the last money they would ever earn, into a private holding vehicle that financed, among other things, the vineyard where he had proposed to me, the lease on his downtown office suite, and a property in the mountains that I had never once been invited to see. My signature, forged, sat on 3 of the documents that authorized transfers out of that holding vehicle. If Marcus went down for this, and it was beginning to look like he would, the question of whether I had knowingly participated would not stay academic for long. Someone, somewhere, was going to ask whether the wife knew. I called my old supervisor that night, a woman named Connie Ashford who had once told me I had the sharpest eye in the building before I disappeared into a marriage that asked me to forget I'd ever had one. She didn't hesitate. "Come back," she said, "not as a favor, as counsel. We need you on this, and frankly, Renata, you need us." I checked myself out of the hospital against the recommendation of my doctor, who told me my body needed rest, and I told her my body had spent 3 years resting itself into invisibility and it was time to wake back up. Marcus called 11 times that first evening. I let every one of them ring through. At 9:42 p.m. he texted, "Where are you? The cleaning service can't find half my files in the home office. Did you move something?" I read that message standing in Connie's conference room with a forensic accountant explaining wire transfer patterns to me on a whiteboard, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the quiet click of a lock turning the right way for the first time in years. The next morning, Marcus showed up at my mother's house where I was staying, dressed for an apology the way he dressed for everything, performatively, with intention, like he was preparing for a photograph. He brought flowers. He brought a card. He told my mother in the doorway before I'd even come downstairs that he had been out of line after the miscarriage, that grief made men say things they didn't mean, that he just needed to talk to his wife. My mother, who had watched me shrink for 3 years and said nothing because she believed it wasn't her place, finally found her voice in that doorway. "She lost a child 3 days ago," she said, "and you called her worthless. There is no version of grief that explains that sentence." Marcus's face did the thing it always did when someone refused to accept his narration of events, a flicker of genuine confusion, as if reality had glitched, followed quickly by a recalibration into wounded sincerity. "I would never," he said. "I think you're misremembering what happened. Renata was very emotional that day." I came downstairs at that moment, and I watched him perform shock at the sight of me, like I was supposed to forget what he'd said simply because he'd said it 3 days ago instead of 3 minutes ago. "I'm not misremembering," I said. "There was a nurse in the room. I can get her statement if you'd like a second opinion." Something in his face shifted, a calculation visible behind his eyes, the math of a man deciding whether to escalate or retreat. He chose retreat for now. "Can we talk privately?" he said, glancing at my mother. I said no. I said whatever he had to say to me, he could say in front of her, because I was done having private conversations that turned into private erasures the moment we were alone together. He hesitated, then delivered an apology so smooth it almost sounded sincere if you didn't already know the shape of his sentences, if you hadn't spent 3 years learning to hear the hollow space underneath his words where actual remorse should have lived. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. "Marcus, do you know a man named Daniel Reyes?" I have never, in 6 years of marriage, seen a human face change that fast. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a flicker. It was a full collapse and rebuild, like watching a house implode and a fortress get thrown up in its place within the same 3 seconds. "Why are you asking me that?" he said, and his voice had lost its performance entirely, gone flat and careful in a way I recognized from depositions I'd sat in on years ago, the voice of a man choosing every word like it might be entered into evidence. "Because his name is on a file I read last night," I said. "Along with a power of attorney with my signature on it that I never signed, attached to transfers out of a senior care fund into an account that paid for our vineyard wedding." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever experienced in my mother's front hallway. Comment below what you think Marcus said next, because I promise you, it was not an apology. "You don't understand what you're looking at," he finally said, which is what men like Marcus always say when you understand exactly what you're looking at. He tried, in rapid succession, every tool in his usual kit. He tried condescension. "Renata, financial structures are complicated. You've been out of the field for years. You're misreading routine paperwork." He tried affection. He reached for my hand and I stepped back before he could touch it, and something about that small physical retreat seemed to unsettle him more than anything I'd said. He tried fear. "If you go anywhere near this with your old firm, you will destroy us. Do you understand that? You will destroy everything we have." I noted, quietly, that he said us, and we, as if I had been a beneficiary of this architecture rather than a forged signature inside it. Finally, when none of it worked, when I simply stood there with my arms crossed and let his words run out of road, he tried the truth, or the version of it he thought I could be talked into accepting. "It started small," he said. "A bridge loan from one account to cover a shortfall in another, just for a few weeks, just until a deal closed. I was going to pay it back. Then the deal didn't close on time, and there was another shortfall, and I needed your name on something because investigators don't look as hard at accounts tied to a spouse who has no financial history of her own. You weren't supposed to ever know. I was protecting you." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it in my mother's hallway. He had forged my signature, attached it to funds stolen from elderly people's retirement savings, and the explanation he offered with a straight face was that he had been protecting me. Not asking me. Not telling me. Protecting me the same way you might protect a child from a piece of bad news, the same way he had decided, 3 years earlier, that I didn't need to worry my head about our finances. The forgery wasn't an aberration. It was the same marriage, just with higher stakes and worse consequences. He had spent 3 years making decisions on my behalf because he had decided, somewhere early on, that I was a person to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted, and the hospital bed was simply the moment the mask came all the way off. I went back to Connie's office that afternoon and told her everything, including the part where Marcus admitted, in front of my mother, that he had knowingly used my name and forged my signature. Priya was already there when I arrived, along with a federal investigator named Agent Sujin Park, who had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had watched 100. Confident men discover that confidence is not the same as innocence. They didn't ask me to wear a wire or do anything out of a movie. What they asked for was simpler and somehow heavier. My professional read on the documents, my knowledge of how Marcus structured his approvals, and my willingness to formally state, on the record, that the power of attorney bearing my name had been executed without my knowledge or consent. I signed that statement with a hand that was steadier than I expected it to be. Agent Park looked up at me when I finished and said, "You understand that once this is filed, there's no quiet version of what happens next." I told her I had spent 3 years living the quiet version of my own life, and I was finished protecting a man who had never once protected me. The collapse, when it came, did not happen all at once, and it did not happen the way Marcus expected, with him in control of the narrative the way he had always been in control of every room he walked into. It happened in pieces, each one smaller and more humiliating than the last. First, the Senior Care Funds Board received a confidential inquiry that froze Vail Capital's access to 3 of its accounts pending review. And Marcus had to explain to his partners, in real time, why money he'd told them was performing exactly as projected was suddenly subject to federal scrutiny. Then Daniel Reyes's full statement was entered into the investigation file, detailing not just the forged power of attorney, but 2 other instances where Marcus had directed junior staff to backdate documents. And Daniel had kept emails, because some part of him, even while complying under pressure, had understood he might need proof one day that he hadn't invented the instructions himself. Then the story, as these things always eventually do, found its way to a financial reporter who had been quietly tracking complaints about Vail Capital for months, and the headline that ran 2 weeks later did not describe Marcus as a victim of his wife's grief-fueled overreaction. It described him as the subject of a federal investigation into the alleged misappropriation of retirement funds belonging to elderly clients, several of whom were quoted by name, describing the savings they had lost. Marcus called me 43 times in the 3 days after that article ran. I did not answer a single one. He showed up at Connie's office building once, was turned away by security at the front desk, and stood on the sidewalk outside for 20 minutes, which I know because Priya watched it happen from the window and described it to me later with an expression somewhere between pity and satisfaction. He sent a letter to my mother's house, handwritten this time instead of typed, the kind of letter designed to be read by other people, full of phrases like, "I never meant for any of this," and "the stress of trying to provide for our family," and unbelievably, one line that said, "I hope one day you can see that everything I did for us." I read that letter once and did not respond to it. Forgiveness, I had learned somewhere in the last 2 weeks, is not owed to a person simply because they have finally run out of other strategies. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed was not Marcus's downfall. It was my own return. Connie offered me a permanent position the same week the investigation became public, not as a consolation prize, but because, as she put it, "You were the best compliance mind I ever trained, and you've spent 3 years sitting on a skill you never should have put down." I said yes before she finished the sentence. I moved out of the house Marcus and I had shared. A house, it turned out, that was itself partially financed through the same holding vehicle under investigation, which meant I left with almost nothing of material value and felt, for the first time in years, entirely unburdened. I rented a small apartment with a window that faced east, and on the first morning I woke up there, with sunlight crossing the bare floor and no one in the next room deciding what my day was going to mean, I cried for the baby I had lost, properly, finally, without an audience deciding my grief was inconvenient. That grief had never belonged to Marcus's ledger. It had only ever belonged to me, and I needed to grieve it without being told I was being dramatic for feeling something real. Marcus was indicted 4 months later on multiple counts of wire fraud and falsification of financial records. I was not charged. My statement, corroborated by Daniel Reyes's documentation and forensic handwriting analysis confirming the signature on the power of attorney, was not mine, established clearly that I had been used, not complicit. I testified before a grand jury, sitting in a small room answering careful questions from a prosecutor who treated my professional opinion with the kind of respect I had nearly forgotten I was owed. Outside the courthouse, on the day the indictment was announced, a reporter asked me for comment, and I gave one sentence, the only one I had prepared. I lost a child and a marriage in the same month, and the only thing that helped me survive both was remembering who I was before I let someone convince me I needed his permission to be her. I walked away before he could ask a follow-up question, and I have never once regretted that I didn't stay to explain myself further. Some sentences are complete on their own. Marcus's mother called me once, near the start of the trial preparations, to tell me I was destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding about paperwork. And I let her finish her entire speech without interrupting, the way I had been trained for years to do. And then I said, calmly, "Your son called me worthless 3 days after I lost our baby, while I was still in a hospital bed. Whatever happens to him now, he built it himself, document by document, decision by decision, and I am done being the person who absorbs the consequences of choices I was never allowed to make." She did not call again. Marcus's case is still moving through the courts as I tell you this, the lawyers' motions stacking up the way they always do, the wheels of accountability turning slower than any of us would like but turning nonetheless. I am told he has lost the firm entirely. His partners dissolved it within weeks of the indictment, unwilling to let his name keep sinking the business they'd built their own reputations on. I am told the vineyard where he proposed to me was sold to cover a portion of the restitution owed to the Senior Care Fund's beneficiaries, which felt, when I heard it, less like irony and more like a kind of rough justice the universe occasionally remembers to deliver on its own. I think often about the version of myself who sat in that hospital bed and let a man tell her she was worthless without saying a single word back, because in that moment, I believed him. I believed I had failed at the one thing he said mattered, and I believed, somewhere underneath the belief, that his opinion of me carried more weight than my own. It took losing a child, and almost losing myself along with it, to remember that I had been a person with a name and a mind and a career long before I became somebody's wife, and that none of those things had ever actually disappeared. They had only been waiting, patiently, in a folder marked with a name I hadn't used in years, for someone to walk through the door and say it out loud again. I work full days now. I mentor 2 junior associates who remind me, in small ways, of who I used to be before I learned to make myself smaller. I see a therapist on Thursdays who has helped me understand that grief and rage can occupy the same body without canceling each other out, that I am allowed to mourn the baby I lost, and despise the way I was treated while mourning her in the very same breath. I have not spoken to Marcus since the day the indictment was announced. I do not know if I ever will again, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty does not frighten me, because my peace no longer depends on his apology, his accountability, or his understanding of what he did. It depends only on whether I keep choosing, every single morning, to live as the woman who walked back into that office and reclaimed her own name. So tell me honestly, if a man called you worthless the day you needed him most, and you later discovered the truth he'd been hiding behind that cruelty the whole time, would you have stayed long enough to find out, or would you have walked out the door the moment you heard the word?